Hello and welcome to our Thursday recording. We're going to be ending our week with an overview of Chapter 1. And as you can see, Chapter 1 is part of Unit 1. And Unit 1, we're working to understand the communication in the workplace. We're going to be going over Chapter 2 and 3 next week, but for this week or today, we are going to be going over Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is Communication and Ethics at Work. Basically, what should you know? Let's start by defining what our textbook says about communication. According to our textbook, communication is not simply the process of transferring thought and ideas from one person to another. Communication is the process of people sharing their thoughts, their ideas, their feelings with each other in commonly understandable ways. So as you can see, communication is a very complex thing. It's not just a simple thing of just sharing process of transferring thoughts and ideas from one person to another. It's a lot of things that go into the act of communication. Communication has evolved in so many ways, but the earlier models of communication came up with something just called a one-way model. And we will also look at the circular model. And lastly, we will look at the transaction model. The first model that we're going to look at and examine is the one-way model. The one-way model views communication as simply a linear process from person A to person B. But it evolved, and they were able to see the fallacy in this particular model because, as you know, communication does a lot more than just that. Then there came something called the circular model. The circular model views communication as an interactive process, and it brought into play the fact that there has to be something called feedback in a frame of reference, which is getting better because they're starting to see communication as something that is a lot more than just simply back and forth, but also they see it as something that is very important, which is listening for feedback. Then that particular model evolved to something called the transaction model. And the transaction model is a simultaneous process that occurs when frames of reference of people A and B overlap, and it creates a deeper meaning in the communication process, which is very important because, as you can see, this is, although it looks like as if it's very, very complex, which it is, but it involves a lot more than just making sure that a message is sent and then received. It makes sure that there's a lot of things that go into the process of just sending and receiving, because a lot of things are overlapping in this particular model. So let's look at what a frame of reference is, because that was mentioned in the transactional model. The fact that a frame of reference is very important. So let's define a frame of reference. The frame of reference are the background and experiences of both the sender and the receiver. And the frames of reference can include things such as your education, your race, your culture, your gender, your attitude, your personality. All those things are a part of the frames of references. Another important thing that goes into the transaction model is the codes. And the codes can be defined as the symbols that carry the message. So let's go into what there are when we talk about codes. There are 3 basic communication codes. The first code is the language. The language code is the verbal code, and it involves spoken or written words. The second code is the paralanguage code, which is the vocal code, and that involves the vocal elements of spoken language, such as the voice, the pitch, the volume, the emphasis, like do you put certain emphasis on words, etc. Those are part of the paralanguage code. And the last code is the nonverbal or the visual code, and it involves all intentional and unintentional means, other than the written or spoken words, that a person uses to send a message. And it can be things such as facial expressions. It can be things such as eye contact, gestures, appearances, the office setting, the environment. All those things go into the nonverbal code. As a matter of fact, if we would put together the vocal code and the visual code, it would be 69% of the language that you would be receiving, and only 31% would be the actual words spoken or written. So you can see how important they all are, but it's very important. Sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it. Like the tone, or are you looking at them, or the facial expressions. So those are important things for us to take into consideration when we are trying to communicate in the workforce. Another important thing for us to remember that was discussed in very much detail is the feedback. Feedback is the verbal and visual responses to a message. And as a matter of fact, there are a number of approaches that can improve the feedback received from others, and there are a number of approaches that can enhance the feedback given to others. But first of all, I want to talk about something that is important, because feedback can offer advantages and it can also offer a lot of disadvantages. So let's discuss the advantages of feedback. The advantages of feedback is that feedback can actually help to improve the accuracy and the productivity of an individual and also of groups. If you offer great feedback, that can happen. It also can increase employee satisfaction. So as a manager, you have to remember that the feedback that you give can help your employees greatly. And it can also help to alleviate any types of fears. Like if you give great feedback, then your employees aren't feeling afraid to listen to the things that you have to say. With that being a good side, there's also the flip side of feedback, which is the feedback can also have a lot of disadvantages. Some of the disadvantages that can happen when you're giving feedback is that you can make people feel like they're under attack. They feel like, oh my gosh, all you do is just give me all these negative things that I'm doing. So they can feel like they are actually under attack. And also, as a manager, feedback can be very time consuming. So you have to be very mindful of that. And feedback can be risky, and it could have negative results. And especially if the person that you are giving feedback to has maybe something that they don't like about feedback, and it can always be viewed as negative. So those are things that can be a disadvantage to you when you are offering feedback, and things that you have to be mindful of. So When giving feedback, there are a number of approaches that we can take when we receive feedback. So if we're the person on the receiving end, we should identify specific feedback desired. So maybe if you have an opportunity or a chance, you can tell people, I like feedback and I like it written. So, be specific about the type of feedback that you desire. Set aside time for your feedback sessions. In other words, don't try to take away the time that is needed for this or needed for that, needed for office remodeling or whatever. We need to work at a specific time that you would like to have time set aside so that you can have a feedback session. And proper feedback channels can be rich. Like maybe some people like face-to-face feedback. Maybe some people like written feedback. So those particular channels can be very rich in giving the place or the type of channel that you should use. Make sure that you use silence when you're receiving feedback. Watch and listen for the responses before you react to the feedback. So when you are receiving feedback, you have to use silence sometimes. And sometimes you have to be encouraging so that you can be ready for the feedback and be rewarded for your feedback. Also, when receiving feedback, you should ask questions or paraphrase. So you're saying that this is what I need to do, or you're saying blah blah blah, or is this what you said? So make sure that you ask questions and use paraphrases. And lastly, when you are receiving feedback, follow up. So in other words, if you receive, I don't know why that's hard to say, maybe perhaps because it's Thursday. But if you are receiving feedback, follow up on the feedback that you received so that the person is aware of the fact that you have received the feedback in a positive way and that you want to follow up. So those are great tips when you are receiving feedback. So some tips when you are giving feedback is to make sure that you are directing the feedback towards the behavior, not the person. So don't be like trying to tear the person down. Be more cognitive of the fact that you should give feedback according to the behavior or according to the task or something, but don't give feedback directly steered at just that particular person. Like in other words, don't try to tear that person down. I don't like it when, or I saw you do this and I don't like that. Make sure that you say, I saw you doing this task and I want to offer you a little bit of feedback. I think that this task could be better served from you or from our company if perhaps we could do it in this way. So make sure that your feedback is not directed towards a person. Be very descriptive and not evaluative. In other words, give great descriptive words so that the person knows that you are trying to help them. Involve sharing, not giving advice. In other words, don't give advice, just share. Share descriptive words. Share things that can help them improve, but don't give advice. Include limited information. In other words, make sure that your feedback is limited to the information that you give. Don't make them go into information overload. End up talking to them for an hour about the same thing over and over. So make sure that you include limited information. Make sure, if you can, that the feedback is immediate and well-timed. If the person has done something and they're crying or whatever, you don't want to walk up and give feedback at that particular time because you might push them over the edge. So make sure that when you're giving feedback, although it's immediate, it is also well-timed. And also, it allows for face saving. In other words, it allows the person a chance to try to improve, so that way they don't feel like they're ashamed for what they did. It allows them an opportunity to save face. The next thing that I found that was important in the chapter is how communication flows inside the organization. I think that that's an important thing that we should address that came from that particular chapter. And we're going to start describing it. Communication flows in the workplace in formal and informal manners. And usually it flows over routes, or the way that we're going to define it is through networks. So it's a formal network, or it can be an informal network. So formal networks are usually things that happen through chain of command. So usually it's something that happens within the organizational chain of command. An informal network is something that is unofficial paths that can be based on friendships or just on a specific information need. So we're going to start by discussing informal. And the informal communication in a workplace is usually referred to as the grapevine. And it exists because of the limitations of formal networks, and are just as important, if not more important in some instances, because information in the grapevine is usually 75 to 95% accurate. And also, grapevine information travels very rapidly. If you want information to travel rapidly, make it part of the grapevine or the informal communication network. People who regularly use the grapevine are more satisfied with their jobs, and usually they are more committed to the organization. They just have things that they just want to say. Effective managers, as a matter of fact, use the grapevine because they can learn about employees' concerns and problems, and even employee satisfaction. And as a matter of fact, informal communication can also indicate the health of the organization, because things that are going through the grapevine either are things that are referring to the organization as healthy, or it can be things that are referring to the organization as unhealthy. Which brings us to the next way that information flows in the organization, and it's through formal means. And information that flows in this way is usually done in 3 directions. The first direction is downward communication flow, and this is from the manager to the subordinates, or from the manager to the employees. When information flows downward, normally it includes things that happen like when the manager is giving the employee their performance appraisal, or when the manager is giving the employee job instructions or job rationales or policies and procedures or motivational appeals like, you can do it, I know you can do it, your team can do it. Those are types of things that flow downwardly from the manager to the subordinates. Sometimes you have to be very careful though, because downward communication flow can also lead to a lot of information overload and possibly employee dissatisfaction, because you are trying to feed them so much information that sometimes it just overloads them. They just are like, I don't want to hear anymore. I really don't. So there's also something called the upward flow of communication that happens in the formal manner. The upward communication flows usually from the subordinates to the managers. This is when the employees have something that they want to say to the managers. And upward communication normally includes employees' work, achievements, and progress. This is how I feel that I'm progressing. Enjoys feelings, your employees' opinions, outlines of work problems, ideas for improvement. So those are all things that employees definitely try to communicate to the subordinates. The subordinates, which are the employees, try to communicate to the managers. And the last particular flow that we're going to discuss is the horizontal flow. And this happens laterally between people, usually in the same rank. So usually it happens from one subordinate to another subordinate, from one manager to the other manager. And horizontal communication is especially important for when you are trying to coordinate tasks, when you are trying to solve problems, when you are sharing information, when you are hopefully resolving conflict, when you are trying to empower teams, when you are talking to each other, and the communication flows laterally, back and forth from one person to the next. Lastly, we're going to discuss something in the chapter that I think is of uttermost importance, which is what the theme of the chapter is about, which is ethics inside the organization. And we are going to start by first defining ethics as it was written in our textbook. In our textbook, it says that ethics are the moral principles that guide judgments about the good and the bad, the right and the wrong of communication. When you're talking about communication ethics, that is the types of things that we have to do. We have to follow a moral path that is guided by our judgments. And in order to do that, there are things that we should avoid and things that we should try to follow. And one of the things that we should try to follow is try to follow 4 ethical rules. And this will help us to be able to have great ethical practices in our organization. And we should base our decisions on these rules. The first rule is the utilitarian. And though that rule says that we should create the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. So the utilitarian rule is a great rule to follow because you ultimately want the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The second rule that we should try to follow is the moral rights rule, and it is essentially the same as the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. So that's a great rule to follow in any type of organization. The third rule is the justice rule, which says that you should provide fair and ethical treatment for all individuals and groups involved in your organization. And that is the way that you would show justice. So that is considered the justice rule. The last rule is the practical rule, which views ethical decisions as easy to communicate to people outside of the company because the typical person would find them acceptable. So there you have the 4 ethical rules that we should try to follow and base our decisions on when we are trying to make decisions that involve other people. And we should always try to avoid ethical traps. There are several ethical traps that we are going to discuss. The ethical traps are such things as the trap of necessity. And this trap says that there are no acceptable choices but the unethical one. which is not a very good thing to follow. And it definitely is a trap that will definitely mess up your organization quickly. Another trap to try to avoid is the trap of relative filth, which is favorably compares any unethical act to the unethical acts of others. So basically you want to avoid this because this isn't going to better anything. The next trap that you should try to avoid is the trap of rationalization, which justifies the unethical acts based on acts taken by others, which is not very good either. The last trap that I want to discuss is the trap of self-deception, and this minimizes the consequences of unethical actions. So in other words, it's like, well, it was just a little lie, or I only took $100. So those are all things that we need to avoid because those traps will ultimately lead to no good. Well, that's all I have for chapter 1. And to quickly summarize the things that we discussed how important communication or great communication is in the workforce, and that even as a manager, employers are looking for employees who can communicate and follow up and use frames of references and offer great feedback or accept feedback. Those are the types of people that organizations are looking for. So that's something that was very important about the chapter. Another thing that we discussed was how effective communicators use both formal and informal communication networks. And that is important, the networks that we use within our organization. And lastly, we discussed how effective communicators are ethical persons, using the things that can help, like using the 4 ethical rules and avoiding the ethical traps. So that's all I have for chapter 1. That is the end of chapter 1. But I want you to be very mindful of the fact that you have to make sure that you turn in your attendance record for today. And make sure you answer the question that is posted for you to do today so that you can get your attendance points and you can be counted as present. Lastly, I want to remind you that for this week, which ends on Sunday night at 11:59, you should have all of your assignments completed and turned in. And we will begin next week on chapter 2 and 3. So I will see you next week on Tuesday to discuss chapter 2. And on Thursday, we will discuss chapter 3. I hope you're having a great week. And if you have any questions at all concerning anything about the course or about the things that are coming due for this week, just give me a shout out, send me an email, and we'll talk it through and work it out. Have a great week and a great weekend, everyone. See you next week.